No matter how you may hate on Britain because it is white, a mother country to many others, or influential far beyond the norm, no one can escape the impact it has had on the world. English is the language of commerce, science, politics, and air travel. The English-speaking colonies are some of the richest and most powerful group of nations on earth. Rome was a great power, and Muslims and Mongols had great empires, but none of them had their culture and mores embedded into the rest of the world's nations like Britain. One can assume if a previous colony developed after the mother country left, it was almost guaranteed to have been a British colony. Even though Britain's power has waned, her influence is greater than ever through the agency of her colonies. But we have not come to praise Britain, to paraphrase the greatest playwright in the world and the greatest prose writing after the KJV Bible, but, if not to bury her, to at least point out how and where she fell short. Because Britain did not reach her full potential. A major element of British culture was her royalty, around which the world's most impressive pageantry has developed. Most persons, regardless of how they may enjoy the pageant and seeing the pomp displays of wealth associated with the royal family, have little appreciation of the part royalty played in making Britain the power it is and was. Moderns, at least, are a people fixated on a world of physical things. It was not always so. There was, for want of a better word, an appreciation for metaphysics. Royalty was more than a family and more than an administrative office. The royal family had a meaning that it no longer has in the modern world. Britain dispossessed itself of its greatest advantage without ever realizing it. The royal family, and particularly the monarch, was Britain. The monarch, particularly in the guise of her queens, was the country. When one fought for or worked for, the monarch, one worked for an ideal. The glory of the monarchy was the manifestation of an ideal that gave the British people a purpose lacking in her competitors. But of course many nations had their royal families. Some, like Britain, still do. On the surface, Britain had nothing that other nations, at least in the West, did not have. For many eons Britain was not a special nation. It was invaded by Romans, Celts, Normans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and others. When Spain threatened England with invasion, it was a real threat. When Wellington beat Napoleon or the Duke of Marlborough beat the French in the Battle of Blenheim, the outcome was far from a foregone conclusion. In fact, the odds were not on the British, which is why these victories are so celebrated. Today the West is all about free trade and open borders, but Britain as an island, was always insular, and it never considered a free trade economy during its era of dominance. The mercantilists were all about wealth measured in bullion. However, Britain never had access to the raw materials that Spain had. This is where it gets interesting. Because despite being known for its empire and its royal family, the world almost begrudgingly must acknowledge Britain as the birthplace of industrial revolution. The island, once marked by a relative scarcity of natural riches compared to continental powers, found in its constraints the very seeds of innovation. By the mid-18th century, Britain was a nation undergoing change. The population was growing, cities were bustling, and the traditional agrarian way of life was giving way to new ideas about work, production, and society. The age-old insularity of the island, once a barrier, became a crucible in which ideas, fueled by necessity and ambition, were forged. Several factors converged to set England apart at the dawn of industrialization. While Britain lacked the gold and silver that enriched Spain, it was rich in coal and iron ore, the perfect fuel for powering new machines. These two key elements were found adjacent to each other, which gave the island a decided advantage. Britain's constitutional monarchy and burgeoning parliament fostered a climate where property rights and innovation were protected. England's political and military might gave it access to great wealth. Since the land was already in the hands of the great land-owning nobility, capitalists were desperate for places to invest. The new wealth of the financial sector enabled investments in new ventures, canals, and factories. England's colonies gave it a stable source of raw materials and customers. Far-reaching trade routes brought raw materials and created new markets for manufactured goods. The Enlightenment's rational spirit pervaded British society, encouraging experimentation and the pursuit of progress. The revolution's spark was technological, marked by a series of inventions that forever changed production. The spinning jenny, 1764. James Hargreaves' machine multiplied the productivity of textile workers, making it possible to spin several threads at once. The water frame, 1769. Richard Arkwright harnessed the power of water to drive spinning wheels, paving the way for factory-based production. The steam engine, 1770s-1780s. Perfected by James Watt, the steam engine liberated industry from riverside locations, providing reliable power for factories and later, locomotives. The power loom, 1785. Edmund Cartwright's invention automated weaving, further accelerating textile production. England's landscape was transformed. Smokestacks supplanted church spires on the skyline. Rural villages gave way to burgeoning industrial cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool. The rhythm of life shifted. Time itself became measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the relentless turning of factory wheels. Job opportunities multiplied as workers left fields for factories. But with progress came hardship. Child labor, long hours, and hazardous conditions became the dark underside of rapid industrialization. Yet, the promise of prosperity and the spirit of invention continued to drive Britain forward. England's innovations did not remain insular for long. The methods, machines, and ambitions that shaped the British Industrial Revolution soon spilled across Europe and the world, unleashing waves of change that defined the modern era. The Industrial Revolution began not with a single thunderclap, but with a series of sparks, innovations, ambitions, and the peculiarities of an island nation whose limitations proved to be its greatest advantage. England kindled the flame that would illuminate the world. These are technical factors. Not all of these factors are present everywhere. But still, every nation has resources. Every nation has people who in the 18th century could have invented steam power and other industrial tools to increase production. Innovation is not unknown in the rest of the world. Islam had its golden age. China was vastly superior in many ways to England and the West, prior to the 18th century, yet they largely stagnated. There are many other parts of the world that innovated and created civilizations, prior to Britain. Researchers have had the habit of looking at more and more features to discover the mix that resulted in the Industrial Revolution. Others have attempted to take some of these features into other areas of the world and create this same dynamic. But we see that the English colonies are the home to successful development, whereas many other colonies of other nations are less successful. Some, like Haiti, are incredible failures. Is it just having access to resources and tools that produces economic development? Does it just take access to capital? England was not the most blessed nation on earth when it comes to natural resources. Nor is it true to say that a nation without resources cannot develop. A few English colonies, such as Singapore, prove that it is not access to resources that permits economic development to happen. Many of the things we say are needed are possessed by nations, such as China, that did not develop economically, whereas nations that lacked the necessities, did develop into very successful economies. So we are forced to conclude there is a factor that has not been given the attention it deserves. So, let's look at a simple, even ideal economy and remove all of the incidentals. We discover that only a limited number of people are needed. But the other necessity is specialization, or specialized abilities. A developing economy needs people with different abilities to make it profitable for them to exchange the products of their labor. We ought to see the one thing the economy does not need and which, if present, will dampen all hope of progress, if present. That is parasitism. The people who are infected with parasites will fail to the degree that parasites are present. A small percentage of parasites will allow for economic development to happen if the rest of the population is numerous. As the percentage of parasites grow relative to the productive group, the more development will slow. However, at issue is not just the proportion of parasites to labor that is important, it is the degree of specialization in the economy that permits the people to be resilient and resist the corrosive impact of parasites on the economy. Therefore, a more developed economy can resist parasitism better than a less developed one can. This explains why developed economies can keep progressing even when socialism is eating it away from within, whilst less developed nations with far less parasitism cannot even begin the developmental process. What Britain knew that gave it an advantage is that everyone must work, and the worker is worthy of his wages. From noble to the lowest everyone sought their place, not as a burden but as an obligation. The British had a duty to their country, and they sought to fulfill it. All this comes down to is that Britain lacked the parasitism of other nations. Each soldier, sailor, merchant, tradesman and noble person sought to do their duty. The individual did not fail the group, and the group did not fail the individual. Britain was a society of equals in that all were equally committed to doing what they were called upon to do, without shirking or adopting the mentality of a victim.